I'm glad you're all here at the Humphrey School. I'm glad that we're able to host FairVote Minnesota in offering this important conversation. I think I rarely use the word now more than ever, because I think now more than ever we're using it now more than ever. But I have to say, in this instance, as we talk about saving our democracy, as we talk about democracy, I do feel like it's appropriate to say it seems more important now than any other time in my lifetime. So I'm glad we're having this conversation. We will hear from Larry Diamond, who I will introduce to you in a moment, and then following his comments, he will be joined on stage with Elizabeth Glidden, and I'm going to introduce her to you now, even though you won't see her for a half hour or so. Elizabeth Glidden is an alum of the Humphrey School. That's the most important thing that you need to know about her. But she is also a public policy professional and a lawyer. She's got a quarter-century of experience in these areas. She is currently the Director of Public Policy and Strategic Initiatives for the Minnesota Housing Partnership. So she's working on housing policy at the federal, state, and local levels. Elizabeth Glidden, if that name sounds familiar and you don't already know, she served this city as a member of the Minneapolis City Council for 12 years, and she served as the Council Vice President from 2013 to 2017. We're really also honored and very fortunate that Elizabeth Glidden serves the Humphrey School now as an adjunct professor, so she's teaching with us. And now let me introduce Larry Diamond. I can never help when I'm at this podium, and I happen to be here a lot introducing people, I feel in a really powerful way the heavy presence of Hubert Humphrey looking down on us over here. And I have to think that, partisanship aside, he would be very supportive of the kind of conversation that we're going to have today. Larry Diamond is an American political sociologist and a leading contemporary scholar and author in the field of democracy studies. He's a professor of sociology and political science at Stanford University and a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. And I always read this and never say it out loud, in the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. Did I get it right? Where he directs the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law. Larry Diamond's most recent book, Ill Winds, is a powerful read, and I was just telling him I had read the review in the New York. I'm not looking at my phone. Well, I am looking at my phone. I'm calling up something I want to read to you quickly. Excuse me. I have not read the full book, but I read with great interest the New York Times review when it came out this summer. And there's this quote that's chilling and important. I don't mean to be gloomy on a Friday, but I think this is really powerful. Talks about the 40 years you've spent circumnavigating the globe and promoting democracy around the world. And yet today he is aghast, the New York Times writes. After 3 decades in which democracy was spreading and another in which it was stagnating and slowly eroding, we are now witnessing a global retreat from freedom. I think that's a pretty powerful and pretty alarming statement. And I think it animates this conversation about what we need to do with our democracy. Also in this book, as I'm sure you will hear, I'm eager to hear what he has to say about this. Larry puts ranked choice voting at the top of his proposed reform list, calling it the master reform, the one most likely to break the logjam on all other reforms as we think about our democracy. So with that, I'm eager to hear what you have to say. Please join me in welcoming Larry Diamond.
Well, thanks for your very gracious introduction, and I'll try to live up to the very high expectations that you've now created. Let me first just pick up on the last theme that you articulated and say that as a more or less lifetime scholar of democracy globally, I have learned and been impressed with the importance of the health and example of democracy in the United States to its appeal and vibrancy and sustainability in the rest of the world. And most of the studies of democratization in this 40-year period that transformed the world and roughly tripled the number of democracies in the world from about 40 to, at one point, as many as 120, have emphasized this fact that the vibrancy and health of American democracy, what Reagan called the shining city on a hill, and our efforts to promote democracy, rather than, if you're watching any congressional testimony in the last couple of days, undermine it, have been very important to the march of democracy around the world. So I'm not going to talk about American foreign policy now. I'm not going to talk about the global situation with respect to democracy now. I want to talk about what's happening in democracy in the United States and the trends in the last several decades and what we can do about them, because there's a general sense that democracy in the United States has been declining. And indeed, if you look at the annual assessments of both Freedom House and The Economist magazine in its annual democracy index, you see statistical evidence supporting the sad assessment that American democracy is in decline. The quality of American democracy is declining, and it's been steadily declining for some years now, to the point where, as was noted in another event last night, The Economist magazine now lists the United States as only 25th in the world in the quality of democracy, behind countries like Estonia and Costa Rica, and in the ranks now, falling into the ranks of flawed democracies. There are several reasons why the quality of democracy has been declining, and I'm not going to get into all the reasons that began in 2016 and then in particular 2017 with the foreign intervention in the American election and the onset of a presidency that I think has abused the Constitution and the rule of law. But it's important to stress that the decline in the quality of democracy did not begin in 2016. The statistical measures reflect a decline beginning several years earlier. And the qualitative assessments of historians and political scientists and journalists in politics who cover American politics perceive a decline in functionality of American democracy. And certainly the statistical evidence in terms of legislative productivity shows a steady decline in the productivity of the Congress, even the ability to pass a budget over a period of some 25, 30 years. And a very important reason for this is the growing political polarization in the United States. We all know it. We see it in a variety of ways in terms of just the difficulty of having conversations about politics. It's gotten to the point in a recent Pew Research Center survey of the American public where 82% of Democrats believe that the Republican Party has been taken over by racists, and 80% of Republicans think the Democratic Party has been taken over by socialists. If you think the opposing party has been taken over by political views and politicians who are morally and in terms of policy terms beyond the pale, if you think that they are a mortal threat to the well-being of the country, and that's another question that Pew and others have been asking, and finding a rising percentage of Americans who think the other party is not only very distasteful, who have a strongly negative opinion of it, but who think it's kind of an existential threat to the country's future, then you're going to be willing to do or tolerate almost anything to keep that other party from coming to power. And this kind of logical inference is strongly supported by the recent experimental work of the Yale political scientist Milan Skolik, who has done a lot of public opinion surveys in which he, and not only in the United States, in countries like Venezuela and Turkey, that are even more tragically and violently politically polarized than the United States. And what he finds across countries is that the more a country is politically polarized, and the more people have polarized political views or postures, and the more they view the other party as beyond the pale, an existential threat, the more willing they are to tolerate and vote again for actions and postures of politicians or ruling parties and presidents that clearly violate the law and the Constitution, which is how Hugo Chavez and Recep Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey kept being reelected. And the more polarized the political system, the more that the center disappears, and the more that the other alternative is perceived to be by the supporters of a, say, illiberal ruling party, morally unacceptable or politically extreme, then the more they just resign themselves to the degradation of democracy, or the more they might be willing to sanction extreme measures, intolerance, and even the use of violence. And let me just say, as a political scientist and someone who reads a lot of the literature, both on the news front and in the scholarly front, we are in a seriously rising danger of political violence in this country as a result of political polarization, to the point where both scholars and law enforcement officials are very worried about what could happen as a result of the outcome of a presidential election that is highly contested, or in which fierce partisans of one party or the other, but it's right now one party that's generating the most acute concerns, are given and are responding to a narrative in which the election is, quote, stolen from them. So the more you have this separation, this polarization, what social scientists call affective, not effective, although it seems to be very effective in terms of being carried out by the people who want to exacerbate it, but affective with an A, polarization, the more it gets emotional and psychologically activating of extreme feelings and passions, the more dangerous it is to democracy. And the more toxic it is in terms of sustaining the political culture that we know is required for democracy, which is a political culture of civility, mutual respect, tolerance for opposing points of view, and most of all, a political culture which values the rules of the game, the Constitution, the rule of law, and the procedures above any political outcome. If we get to a point, which I fear we are getting to, where people value the outcome more than the rules, more than democracy itself, That's what sanctions executive coups or executive seizures of power in other parts of the world, like Russia, Venezuela, Turkey, Hungary, now the Philippines. And that's what prompts some passionate supporters to even potentially be willing to use violence. So that's my first point. We are playing for very high stakes here in terms of the defense of democracy, and our democracy has been in decline. My second point analytically is that political polarization has been increasing in the United States, but it's more a phenomenon at the elite level than the mass level. Now, to say that may seem to be in contradiction to the point I just made, that 82% of Democrats think that the Republicans have been taken over by racists, and the parallel figure in terms of Republicans thinking that the Democrats are now mainly socialists. But in fact, there still is a lot of overlap ideologically among ordinary people in the United States. And we know that, in fact, the American public is not separating more and more into Republicans and Democrats. In fact, a growing proportion of the American public say they don't identify with either party. They identify as independents. And it's now the case that about 40% of the American electorate, could be slightly more in one poll, slightly less in another, say they don't identify with either party. They consider themselves to be independents. Some of these people do lean Democrat or lean Republican, but the fact that they say they're independents means that most they only lean, and they don't have these same fanatical attachments and these same extravagant fears of the other party as much as party identifiers do. There is still significant overlap on the ideological spectrum between Democrats and Republicans, and of course with independents tending to be in the middle. If you look at what's happened in the United States Congress over the last 40 years, in terms of the overlap in voting patterns on an ideological scale that's been developed of congressional voting behavior, where one is a perfect score on the conservative end and -1 is a perfect score on the liberal end. You see in the last 40 years the Republicans moving like this very dramatically, particularly in the House, in their voting behavior from about 0.4 to 0.7. The Senate a little less ideologically extreme, but moving very sharply in that direction, particularly in the last 20 years. And Democrats not as sharply moving down in the liberal direction, but the separation as well. And so the two parties are veering away like this in terms of their congressional voting behavior. It used to be the case in recent decades that there was significant overlap in voting behavior, that there were a lot of Republicans who were more liberal in their voting behavior than the most conservative Democrats. And vice versa, there are a lot of Democrats who were more conservative in their overall voting behavior than the most liberal Republicans. And when you've got a lot of people mixed up in that way, it creates room for compromise. You can fashion ad hoc coalitions. Obviously, people will have different degrees of liberal and conservative depending on the issues. But if you've got people who are overlapping in their ideological orientation, it's easier to fashion compromises. And if you just do the distribution of Republicans on a voting scale, leaning obviously increasingly toward the conservative end, and Democratic senators and House members over time moving more and more in a liberal direction, what you see on the two distributions of voting behavior of all the Republican senators and then all the Democratic senators, all the Republican House members and then all the Democratic House members, is there's no longer any overlap. There is not a single member of the United States House of Representatives where their voting record, given the party they're coming from, overlaps with the voting record that is of the other. Or to be more specific, there's no House Democrat that has a more conservative voting record than the most liberal House Republican, and vice versa. And of course, there are a few moderate to maybe slightly conservative House Democrats. There really are no more liberal Republicans in the House of Representatives. So we've seen the two parties separating away. Finally, I want to say, if you study the separation in ideological orientations among Republicans and Democrats at the mass level, while they're becoming more polarized over time, it's not nearly as severe as the politicians. And then if you take the mass public and break them up into people who are very active in politics, they follow the news closely, they participate in campaigns, they give money to the campaigns, and the people that are less active in politics, it's the people who are more active, who are much more polarized than the rest of the public. Now, why am I saying all this as a preface to the rest of my presentation? I'm doing so because you should have grasped from what I've laid out so far the role of our elections in producing a United States Congress that is far more polarized than the American people. And you should have grasped that the mediating factor in producing this is that the people who are not in Congress but are more active politically are more polarized than their fellow citizens. These people who are more active give the money to candidates that pull them in these competing directions, volunteer in their campaigns and are pulling them to these ideological polls, and are much more likely to turn out to vote in low turnout party primaries that nominate these candidates. We are increasingly then moving in the age of mass primaries, in the age of increasing dependence on financial contributions, toward a Republican Party where it's not only the case that people are getting elected are much more conservative than they used to be, that's the people who are being nominated. And we're seeing, the argument was that it was much more of a polarizing phenomenon on the Republican side than the Democratic side. The statistical evidence supports that, but I think we're now in an era where the Democrats are. This is not a judgment statement, it's just a descriptive statement, more to the left, more progressive, further away from the Republicans than they used to be. If you have a pair of options at the election, where one is increasingly to the right, the other is increasingly to the left, and that's mainly who's getting elected, it's not surprising that you can't get much done. Then you add Twitter, social media, 501c4 and dark money and other independent political action committees, special interests coming in and targeting in the primary campaign anyone who would compromise on guns, immigration, or anything else. And these dynamics are freezing our political system, driving it to increasing polarization and dysfunctionality, and making American democracy, frankly, unworkable and unworthy of emulation in the rest of the world. If you don't attack and change these perverse incentives, nothing else we're calling for in terms of civic education, in terms of more responsible citizenship, in terms of better use of and regulation of social media, in terms of a problem solver caucus in the United States Congress, and some of the other things that groups like No Labels are trying to do to make the Congress function better. Nothing else is going to work because people respond to incentives and politicians respond to incentives. And if they think their re-election depends on ideological and partisan orthodoxy, and that compromise will be political suicide, they're not going to compromise. And they're not going to compromise, not because they're bad people. This is the most important thing I have to say to you. They're going to eschew compromise because they don't want to commit political suicide. I'm very fond of saying the following, not because I'm happy about the reality, it's just true. There's a reason why, in fact, we're seeing it now play out in real time. There's a reason why Profiles in Courage is such a short book. Politicians respond to incentives. So if you don't change the electoral incentives, you're not going to get better, more accommodating, more functional behavior in the United States Congress. And so then people think, well, how can we fix this? One reform that people have come up with is something called the jumbo primary, or the nonpartisan primary, the blanket primary, what we have in California, top two. Just forget about parties. Have one round early in the season when you'd have a primary, and it'll just be a first round, and whoever gets the top two, whoever the top two finishers, they'll go to the general election, and it could be 2 Democrats in a heavily Democratic state, 2 Republicans in a heavily Republican state, and then maybe other voters will come in and elect the more moderate of the 2. That was the logic behind the California reform. But remember what I said? Primary elections, what we've learned is you can't ask too much of the voters, right? And the more you have a party primary, or even a first round in a blanket primary election, months in advance of the general election, the lower turnout is going to be. And who turns out in a first round, low turnout election? It's the more ideologically committed, so you've still got that kind of choice at the end. And in some ways, top 2 can make it worse because then nobody can come in by law into the final round. This is why I think top 2 is a deeply flawed system. Open primaries don't make it much better. You can say, oh, we'll fix this. We'll have nonpartisan primaries in the sense that, yes, there'll be a Republican primary and a Democratic primary, but anybody, independents or even a Democrat, can vote in the Republican primary and vice versa. It sounded to me as a political scientist like a promising reform. It's had virtually no effect on the ideological orientation of the candidates who get nominated. Again, because even in an open primary, the people who turn out to vote in each of the party primaries are the more ideologically committed. The only political reform I can imagine that can generate a direct and powerfully different set of incentives to this kind of destructive political dynamic that we are in now is ranked choice voting. And I say that for the following reasons. First of all, we need more choices.
Yeah.
And you look at the public opinion data from the American public, and when you ask them, would you like to have more plausible, not formal, on the ballot, but everyone knows they've got no chance, more plausible choices other than just Republican and Democrat, and people like that. The people who are opposed to ranked choice voting, I will say, are disproportionately people who claim that they favor choice, competition, and open markets in the economy, but oppose them in the political system. And it's a level of ideological consistency, and maybe, if you want to call it, hypocrisy, that I think is very difficult to defend. Ordinary people actually like choice and competition, period, in everything, in their social life, their economic life, and their political life. What if we had more choice and competition? What if, instead of going into the ballot box to choose a governor, the state legislature, a member of Congress, a senator, perhaps someday president, and voting for one person, and whoever got the most votes wins, and therefore you know that if you like an independent better, if you like a libertarian or a Green Party candidate or somebody else better, you can vote for them, but you're just throwing away your vote. You might as well drop your ballot in the wastepaper basket, because that person has no real chance of winning. And therefore that person is a spoiler. What if, instead of that, you could rank that person first? And if they don't win by getting a majority of first preference votes, if nobody wins by getting a majority of first preference votes, then generally the way ranked choice voting works is the candidate with the lowest number of first preference votes is eliminated, and there's an instant runoff. And you then transfer the votes of the loser, the second preference votes of the loser, to the other candidates. And then you see again, has someone emerged with the majority of votes. And if not, you keep having these instant runoffs until somebody gets a majority or all the votes are exhausted. This is going to enable independents to run. It's going to open up our political process. We know from evaluating the election campaigns using ranked choice voting here in the Twin Cities and in a couple of other places, that it seems to lead, by the evaluation of voters, to less negative campaigning. And the reason why is, just think about this. If you're in a two-person race, your consultants are going to tell you the following. Number one, go negative. Maybe you're going to say, I don't like doing that. That's not who I am. And they're going to say, sorry, it's what you have to do to win. And they're going to say, well, look, it's going to make me look very bad if I go negative. Your consultant is going to say, correctly, you're right, you will look bad, but your opponent will look worse. And this is why our campaigns are so negative, is because people know this is true. If you have 3 or more plausible candidates in the race, it's very hard to go negative against your principal opponent, because you're going to look bad, and actually it's the third candidate that people may defect to in disgust with all this negativity. And you'll start seeing candidates emerge, I think, from the creative center, many of them independents, who will put pressure on the parties to move to the center in 2 respects. Number one, the center candidate, if they are able to even kind of place second ahead of one of the parties, then all of the candidates from the other party are going to wind up in the final runoff voting for the moderate, and maybe some of the people from the party that remains in the election but don't like an extreme alternative. And I believe we'll get to the point with ranked choice voting where we'll have a non-trivial number of independents in the House and Senate. And they may determine in a close election who organizes the House or Senate. And they may compel either party that seeks to control the House or Senate to agree to more fair and more open and workable rules, which Nancy Pelosi actually already had to partially agree to in the House because of the power of the moderates who got elected in this last 2018 midterm election which will also draw some of the poison out of our politics and make them work better. So we'll have more moderation, more ability to compromise, more workable politics. I'll close on this note. Many incumbents in the United States Congress would like to compromise, but fear not being renominated. If they lose their party primary, in about 45 states, they are not allowed to have their name on the ballot in the general election because of something called the sore loser rule. And that is another problem in terms of inducing moderation. If you also eliminate the sore loser rule, which I strongly favor, then if you get someone like Lisa Murkowski, who's defeated in a Republican primary by the Tea Party, she won't have to run as a write-in candidate in order to get reelected, which Senator Murkowski could do because the Murkowski name is a household name in Alaska. Most incumbents don't have decades-long household names that would facilitate a write-in campaign in a larger state. If you do those two things, I personally think you're going to dramatically transform the culture and functionality of our politics. So that's my presentation.
Good afternoon, everyone. Let me get set up here. My name is Elizabeth Glidden, and thank you very much to the Dean for this lovely introduction, but also for hosting this important conversation about the state of our democracy. And I also want to say thank you to FairVote Minnesota for bringing Larry Diamond here and helping us engage with him in multiple venues for conversation, including today. I was introduced by talking a little bit about, I have a past history with local government, and which is actually my introduction to ranked choice voting, and I thought I might just ground us a little bit in what's happening in Minnesota. When I was elected, this is in the mid-2000s, I was one of 13 members of a city council for the city of Minneapolis, and I got assigned to be chair of what's considered kind of a little committee at the time. It was the elections committee. And honestly, I think I might not have been on the popular end at that moment in time of the council president's direction of where to go. Little did I know that would be sort of the linchpin of how I came to understand the importance of structural reform and what that can do, because we were just about to embark in Minneapolis on a ballot initiative where the voters directed the city on a 2/3 vote to implement ranked choice voting. And then we went through a series of stages in the city of Minneapolis trying to understand what would that mean to implement this important structural reform. And in the city of Minneapolis, we have now had 3 different elections utilizing ranked choice voting. And I will just say it's been fascinating to see how over time we have started to see changes in who runs for election, how the elections are conducted, and what are the outcomes of those elections. And it really has been a shift that's been taking place over time. So now in the state of Minnesota, we have multiple cities around the state that are exploring ranked choice voting. St. Louis Park is the most recent city to decide to utilize ranked choice voting in their local elections, and we're looking at how to bring this reform to the next level, to the state level. And there's a lot of activism around that. And so that kind of brings me to what is my first question. And I will say this is an opportunity here for us all to engage in dialogue with Larry. And so I really hope that there are a couple questions from the audience, and I can then repeat your question. But so you have identified ranked choice voting as a top reform that you recommend, one of your favorite reforms, and I know from attending an event with you last night that there are many other reforms also that you have identified as important, even if this is one of the most important structural reforms. So I'm curious, based on your experience studying and observing kind of the international scene as well as the United States, we have a lot of activism around ranked choice voting and other reforms. What do you think are those ingredients that move us from the little initiatives to a bigger decision by our country to enact structural reform? What's it going to take?
Well, you might not like my answer.
I'm curious as to your answer.
You know, the comparative study of election reforms shows not that it requires, but it is often driven by political crisis. And the deeper we sink into crisis, dysfunctionality, and polarization, poisonous polarization, I think the more appealing this will be. But, you know, how long do you want to wait to sink further and further into the muck of this and the pain of this toxicity? So I think then what it takes now is powerful mobilization and, in a way, translation, communication, framing, to enable people to understand that a substantial element of the political polarization we are seeing and really detesting in our politics. People don't want this. They want more compromise. All of the polls show this, is as a result of the structural incentives. And so if you can make this link between our electoral systems and the incentives it's generating on the one hand, and the outcome we're seeing in state legislatures and in the Congress and in the relations between the legislatures and the executives on the other hand, I think you can really bring people along. So it's then you get into the old-fashioned logic of democracy, which involves mobilization, education, and persuasion. And it's gonna take doing that on a large scale with a very passionate, well-informed army of volunteers.
I am curious about how important you think the intersection of ranked choice voting is with other reforms that you have also mentioned. And one of those that I think about a lot, because you've talked about districts from which activists may control an agenda, but I also think you've referred to gerrymandering, and I'll kind of take us back to my own home state of Kansas.
Oh.
I grew up in Wichita, Kansas, which is a more democratic city within a fairly conservative state. When I was growing up there, Dan Glickman was the longtime congressman, a Democrat who had a long career then as he served the United States. Today, this is not an area where you can elect a Democrat, or it's extremely difficult, and yet Kansas is able to elect a Democrat to the governor's seat. So what do you think is the importance of gerrymandering to allowing ranked choice voting and other reforms to kind of take their best effect?
Well, let me address this in a couple of ways. First of all, there's an important kinship between different types of political reforms. Let's just speak for a moment about partisan gerrymandering and ranked choice voting versus the current system of first past the post. The kinship is in two ways. Gerrymandering a little bit, less than some people think, but still some. And first past the post a lot
is driving political polarization in the United States. It's taking the worrisome levels of political polarization we already have and magnifying them into the legislature and its functioning internally and in relation to the executive. And so both of these reforms, nonpartisan drawing of district boundaries and moving from first past the post to ranked choice voting, would reduce political polarization in the United States. But there's something else, and I think this has to be an extremely prominent element of the narrative in reform campaigns. Both of these reforms are just more democratic. I repeat, people want more choice, want more competition. The idea of having a two-party duopoly that's locked in and self-perpetuating and that makes it practically impossible for independents or third-party candidates to get even a fair hearing just sounds kind of not right to Americans. It sounds, when you explain it to them, kind of unfair and even sleazy. And what could sound more sleazy than having politicians draw their own district boundaries for the purpose of increasing their party's representation, unfair representation, to an even more unfair degree in their legislative body. I will say in this regard, sometimes politicians, in moments of weakness or arrogance, lapse into moments of lucid honesty in betraying their real motives. And one of them came in North Carolina after the North Carolina lower house redrew the district boundaries under court order, by the way, few years ago. And the leader of the North Carolina House said the following: the only reason why we drew a redistricting plan that gave the Republicans 10 of the 13 seats in the House of Representatives, which is what the US House of Representatives, is what the Republicans still have, even though North Carolina now is kind of a 54% Republican, 45% Democrat state in the House vote. The only reason why we drew a redistricting plan that gave us 10 of the 13 seats is because we couldn't figure out a way to give ourselves an 11th seat. Now, you know, that isn't going to fly with most Americans. And so I think you can just go to the people with a campaign for fairness and, you know, democracy on both reforms, and one reinforces the other. Obviously, if you get a less gerrymandered legislature, you'll also get more moderates, a fairer partisan balance, and a better chance of passing ranked choice voting, and vice versa.
You know, I will say I know that the ability to elect moderates is central to some of the arguments that you have posed in favor of the structural reform. I will say, as a longtime fan of ranked choice voting, I don't know that that is the argument that has been most important to me personally. And I just say that because I'm curious what you think about the importance of, or maybe it's more a question of what does the science say, the social science say about how you run your campaign, how that affects your ability to govern. And I will say for myself, that has been a more important aspect of the structural reforms, and also the ability for more candidates to feel free to enter into that campaign space and then hopefully in their minds become, as you said, plausible candidates.
So let me say first, I'm really glad to hear you say that. Thank you. Mm-hmm. And thank you for your public service. Second of all, I think what ranked choice voting the most powerful effect it's going to have is on inducing compromise, facilitating compromise. And compromise can come from people, and needs to come from people with very strong points of view. But they realize sometimes, even if they have a strong progressive agenda or a strong conservative agenda, those are their beliefs, that you can't get anything done unless you compromise. And unless people from diverse points on the ideological spectrum are willing to compromise, our democracy is not going to function in a way that can address and solve our most important problems. The other thing I want to say, Elizabeth, is that many of the biggest fans of ranked choice voting are people with very strong ideological points of view. And they include the Green Party and the Libertarian Party, and people who want a radically smaller government, and people who want a much bigger government. And they recognize they can't get a fair hearing in the American electoral system under the current rules. They're marginalized and have no real chance to appeal for people's votes. And I think what they're thinking now is not, oh, if we can get ranked choice voting, we'll win an election. It is, if we can get ranked choice voting, we'll start getting some first preference votes of people. And we'll start getting a fairer hearing because it's going to matter. There's going to be more choice. Maybe some people give us their second preference votes. And over time, maybe we can build up from that and make a stronger case. Or maybe we'll be more relevant because, some people will want our second preference votes. The point is, this involves wider, fairer, and more inclusive participation. Also, I think it will increase voter turnout because people will find elections more interesting with more meaningful choices. So for all these reasons, I think you don't have to be a moderate to favor ranked choice voting. You just have to be a Democrat with a small d.
Oh, we do have, what is your question?
Well, it's a complicated question, so I'll try and simplify it by making it a simple question. But I was around when so it goes back a while. But having read the biography of LBJ by Carol Lyons, as well as Joseph McCarthy's University of Wisconsin biography, and I think of those two gentlemen, the question would be, first of all, how would those two gentlemen, in your mind, show up in the world you described today? And then the second part of that question is, how do you think they would react to the voting system that you're proposing?
One was LBJ and the other was Joe McCarthy?
Joseph McCarthy, Senator from Wisconsin.
Well, Joe McCarthy, I think, bears a very significant resemblance to the current leader of the party that he was a member of. And both of these individuals operate on a logic of fear and polarization. And so I can't imagine that he would have liked ranked choice voting. It works against the logic of mobilizing fear and leaving people with only two choices, one of which is designated in McCarthy's era as a bunch of communists, or in the current era as, maybe also socialists, or opening up the country to invasion by immigrants who are coming as criminals and rapists, et cetera, et cetera. So it's pretty clear what McCarthy would have thought. As to LBJ, one of the most famous phrases of LBJ was, "Come, let us reason together." LBJ was a deal maker, and I think he would be very frustrated by the current U.S. Congress and the inability to fashion compromises. This is what he did as Senate Majority Leader and as President, was fashion compromises and bang out legislation. And if you've got a party that has retreated, well, two, but one in particular, deep into the rabbit hole of polarization and is unavailable for deal making, I think poor old LBJ would have been very unhappy. Now look, he was a very partisan Democrat, let's be honest. So it would go against his grain, but I like to think that when he thought about it, he might find appealing the underlying logic of it in terms of inducing compromise.
And would the social media today would have changed outcomes with both of those gentlemen?
Well, of course, social media would have been a great venue for Joe McCarthy to propagate his fake news and false allegations and anti-democratic hysteria. And, well, I don't think even LBJ would have been tweeting like the current president is.
So with that, I think that might be a good place
Okay.
for us to end. I just want to say again, thank you so much. This was fun.
Oh, sure.
I had more. I just want to let you know. So maybe after. But and for anyone who has questions, FairVote Minnesota will be available outside after this program. And thank you very much to Humphrey. And thank you very
Great.
much.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you for